My name is Kai Ashworth. I am 24 years old and I scored the goal that won Kestrel United the league title. 92nd minute, corner from the left, a flick at the near post and the ball crossed the line before the referee had even finished his signal to check the replay. 40,000 people rose out of their seats. My teammates were already sprinting toward me with their arms wide open, and I stood still. I did not run. I did not slide across the turf or pull my shirt over my head. I turned my back on the away end where the celebrations were starting, and I walked toward the family stand, and I pointed at a single empty seat in the second row. Row 12, seat 8. It had been empty for every home game that season. I had bought it myself every year for 7 years, and I had never let anyone sit in it. My captain, Marcus Webb, grabbed my shoulder that day and asked me who it was for. I did not answer him, not then. It took another 11 days, a police file from an unrelated fraud case, and one phone call at 11 at night before anyone understood what that seat actually meant. I want to tell you the whole thing from the beginning, because the goal was never really the story. The seat was. I grew up 2 streets from Kestrel United's old training ground, back when it was still just a gravel car park and 3 portable buildings that leaked when it rained. My mother worked nights at a hospital laundry, and most afternoons I let myself into an empty flat and waited for her to come home. Football was the only thing that made the waiting shorter. I was 8 years old when a man named Walter Doyle stopped his car outside a 5-a-side pitch where I was playing against boys 3 years older than me and watched for 20 minutes without saying a word. Everyone called him Wally. He ran the youngest age group at the academy, and he had a reputation for being blunt to the point of rudeness, the kind of coach who would tell a parent their son had no future in the game rather than take their money for another year of false hope. He walked over to me after that match, crouched down so we were eye level, and said one sentence that I have never forgotten.
"You were not the fastest boy out there, and you were not the strongest, but you were the only one who was already thinking about his next touch before the ball arrived. That is worth more than both of the other 2 put together." He signed me to the academy that week, and for the next 9 years he was the closest thing to a football father I had. He drove me to trials when my mother's shifts would not allow it. He paid for boots twice out of his own pocket and never once mentioned it again. He was hard on me in ways that felt unfair at 14 and felt like love by the time I was 17. He used to say that talent gets you noticed and character gets you kept, and he repeated it so often that I still hear it in his voice before every match I play. Wally was never the academy director. He was a scout and an age group coach, respected inside the club, but never given the bigger job, mostly because he refused to play the politics that came with it. The man who did get the bigger job, eventually, was Desmond Voss. Voss had been a decent lower league midfielder in his playing days, the kind of career that ends quietly and without ceremony. He came into coaching through the analysis side, all spreadsheets and data models, and he was very good at telling a boardroom exactly what it wanted to hear. By the time I was 16, Voss was already head of football operations, and Wally answered to him. I did not think much about the tension between them at the time. I was 16 and only cared about starting for the under-18s. It was only years later, once I understood what actually happened, that I recognized how strange it had always been that Voss avoided being alone in a room with Wally, and how quickly he changed the subject whenever anyone brought up the season that ended Wally's career. That season was 7 years ago, when I was 17 and still 2 years from my first team debut. Kestrel United were fighting relegation, 10 points adrift with 8 matches left, and the training ground was thick with the kind of fear that makes grown men say things they regret. There were rumours across the division that season of a betting syndicate paying for inside information on team selection and injuries, and the football authorities were watching several clubs, ours among them. In March of that year, the Integrity Unit of the Football Association opened a file on Kestrel United after a betting company flagged unusual patterns of wagers placed just before 3 of our matches, always timed within an hour of when the starting lineup would have been finalised inside the building. Someone inside the club was leaking information, and it was making somebody outside the club a great deal of money.
The investigation traced the calls to a mobile number registered to Walter Doyle. 3 calls, each made from inside the training ground on the mornings of the flagged matches, each lasting less than 90 seconds, each placed to a number linked to a known betting intermediary. Wally denied making any of the calls. He told the disciplinary panel that his phone had gone missing from his coat pocket more than once that spring, and that he assumed he had simply misplaced it in the changing rooms. Nobody on the panel believed him, because nobody had a reason to look any further. Voss, who by then sat on the club's internal review committee, told the panel that Wally had access to team sheets before anyone else in the building, which was true, and that Wally had been under financial pressure that season, which was also true, because Wally was still quietly paying my boot bills and driving boys to trials on his own wage. The FA banned Walter Doyle from all football-related activity for 8 years. Kestrel United terminated his contract within a week, issued a short statement about protecting the integrity of the game, and never mentioned his name again. He lost his coaching badges. He lost the pension he had built over 2 decades. Old colleagues stopped returning his calls, not because they believed the worst of him, but because nobody wanted to be seen defending a man the FA had already condemned. I was 17, and the club told the youth squad that Mr. Doyle had left for personal reasons. I found out the truth from a newspaper on the coach on the way to an away match, and I remember reading it twice because the words did not match the man who had crouched down on a 5-a-side pitch 9 years earlier and told me my next touch mattered more than my speed. I went to see him 3 days later. He was living in a small terraced house on the edge of town, and he opened the door looking older than I remembered, though it had only been a few months since I had last seen him at training. He told me not to visit again. He said the club would see it as taking sides, and that my career could not survive being associated with a scandal, even one I had nothing to do with. I did not listen to him. I visited anyway, quietly, usually late at night, for years, and we never once discussed the FA case in detail, because every time I raised it, he changed the subject to my touch, my movement, my decision-making in the final third, as though coaching me was still the only part of his old life he was allowed to keep. He never once told me he was innocent. He never asked me to fight for him. He simply kept coaching me from his front room, watching recordings of my matches on an old laptop, texting me notes after every game whether I had played well or badly. I made my first team debut at 19. He was not allowed inside the stadium. He watched from a pub across the river that showed the match on a small television above the bar because his ban meant he could not set foot inside any ground affiliated with the Football Association, home or away, for 8 years. The year I turned 20, I bought a season ticket in row 12, seat 8 of the family stand, directly in Wally's eye line of the pitch, from where he used to sit as a boy watching his own father play for the reserves decades earlier. I never told anyone why. I left it empty every single match, home and away travel excluded, for 7 seasons. Reg Pauling, our long-serving kitman, was the only person who ever asked me about it directly on a rainy Tuesday 2 years ago while we were packing training bibs into a hamper. Reg said that seat had been empty a long time for someone who apparently did not exist, and that in his experience a man does not keep a seat empty for a stranger.
He said Wally Doyle had been a good man who took a fall that never sat right with him, and that some records from that season never did add up the way the club wanted people to believe. I asked him what he meant. He shrugged and said some things are better left in the past, and went back to folding bibs, and I did not push him because I did not yet have anything solid enough to push with. This season, Kestrel United were fighting for the title for the first time in 17 years, level on points with Dreymouth Rovers going into the final round of matches. Wally's ban, which had run its 8 years the previous winter, technically meant he was free to return to a football ground. He never did. He told me over the phone that he did not want to be a distraction during a title race, and that walking back into that stadium as a man who had been publicly disgraced would only invite questions the club did not need answered during the run-in. I asked our manager, Ollie Bratmell, if I could arrange a seat for an old family friend for the final match. He said of course, and never asked who. I did not tell Wally I had arranged anything. I simply left the seat as it always was, empty, and hoped that one day soon it would not have to be. Desmond Voss, meanwhile, had become the club's director of football, one tier below the chairman, and the man who now sat in on every disciplinary matter involving current or former staff. In the weeks before the final match, journalists preparing retrospective pieces on the title run kept asking him about the club's darkest season, the relegation battle and the betting scandal, and I noticed something I had never paid attention to before. Voss always gave the same 3 sentences, word for word, every single time, about the club having acted with full transparency and cooperated fully with the authorities. He never varied the phrasing. He never once said Wally's name out loud in front of a camera.
The final match arrived on a Sunday in May. Kestrel United against Fenwick Athletic, with Dreymouth playing at the same kick-off time 200 miles away. We needed a win, and any result other than a Dreymouth win, to lift the title outright. The match was level at 1 goal each, with 4 minutes of normal time remaining when Fenwick's goalkeeper caught a cross under pressure from Marcus Webb, and the referee awarded a corner rather than the penalty half our stadium was screaming for, which was the correct decision under the laws of the game, since replays later confirmed minimal contact. I took the corner myself from the right, whipped low and hard toward the near post, and our centre-back, Dominic Ferreira, flicked it on with the outside of his boot. The ball fell to me at the 6-yard line. I got the smallest connection with the inside of my right foot, enough to send it past a despairing dive from the goalkeeper and in off the underside of the crossbar. The assistant referee's flag stayed down. The video assistant referee checked the position of Ferreira's flick for offside because the margin was tight, and confirmed the goal was legal after a review that felt like it lasted an hour and actually lasted 40 seconds. 92nd minute. Kestrel United's travelled fans and 40,000 more inside our own ground erupted at the same instant news came through that Dreymouth had only drawn. We were champions. I did not celebrate the way I had imagined celebrating that moment for 17 years of supporting this club before I ever played for it. I walked straight to the family stand, found row 12, and pointed directly at seat 8, which was, as it had been for 7 years, empty. Marcus reached me first, out of breath, delighted and confused in equal measure, asking who I was pointing at. I told him it was nobody, not because I wanted to lie to him, but because I genuinely did not know at that moment whether Wally was even watching. I found out later that he was watching from his usual spot in the pub across the river, and that when the goal went in, he stood up so fast he knocked his pint over, and that a stranger sitting beside him asked if he knew the scorer, and Wally said only that he used to.
The post-match press conference turned strange quickly. A reporter from the regional paper, who had clearly noticed the empty seat gesture on the broadcast, asked me directly who row 12, seat 8 belonged to. I said it belonged to someone who taught me that talent gets you noticed and character gets you kept, and that I was not ready to say more than that yet. It was a clumsy answer, and it did not satisfy anyone, and by that evening the phrase "empty seat mystery" was trending across every football account I followed.
11 days later, everything changed because of a case that had nothing to do with Kestrel United at all. A betting intermediary named Colm Fitzgerald was arrested in connection with a much larger match-fixing investigation involving lower league fixtures across 2 divisions, an operation the Football Association's Integrity Unit had been building for over a year. When investigators seized Fitzgerald's old business records as part of that unrelated case, an analyst named Priya Chandran, cross-referencing every historic number in his files against previous investigations, found a phone number that matched one flagged 7 years earlier in the Kestrel United case, the same intermediary number that had received those 3 90-second calls attributed to Walter Doyle. What the original investigation had never checked, because nobody had asked the question at the time, was which handset inside the training ground had actually placed those calls. Only which registered number appeared on the billing record. Fitzgerald, hoping to reduce his own sentence, told investigators he remembered the voice on those particular calls clearly because the man had specifically warned him never to call back on that number, since it, quote, was not really his. Chandran pulled the original cell tower data that the first panel had never fully examined and cross-referenced it against staff attendance logs from that spring. Walter Doyle's own attendance record showed he had left the training ground before 8 that morning on 2 of the 3 flagged dates to visit his mother, who was dying of cancer in a hospice 40 minutes away, a fact he had never disclosed to the original panel because he considered it private and irrelevant to a case about phone records, not realizing it was the one fact that could have cleared him. The staff sign-in log, however, showed exactly one other senior member of staff still inside the building at the times those calls were placed: Desmond Voss. Chandran's team requested a formal re-interview. Voss initially repeated the same rehearsed sentences he had given every journalist for 7 years. It was only when investigators told him they had Fitzgerald's statement describing the caller's voice cross-matched against an old recorded interview Voss had given to local radio that same spring, discussing the club's injury situation in a voice a forensic audio analyst assessed as a strong match, that Voss asked for a solicitor and stopped answering questions that day.
I found out through Chandran herself, who called me directly because the FA's disclosure rules required them to inform Walter Doyle before the story became public, and Wally, in turn, called me before he called anyone else. He did not sound triumphant. He sounded tired, the way a man sounds when a weight he has been carrying so long he forgot it was there finally gets set down. The formal reopened hearing happened 3 weeks after the season ended. Voss did not contest the evidence once it was laid out in full. He admitted in a written statement read to the panel that he had run up significant gambling debts of his own that season, debts owed to people who had begun making threats against his family, and that a contact from his playing days had offered to clear those debts in exchange for early team news.
He said he had used Wally's phone on the mornings in question, borrowed under the excuse that his own handset needed charging, specifically because he knew Wally's access to team sheets made him a plausible suspect if anyone ever asked questions, and that once the investigation actually did start looking at Wally instead of him, he told himself that staying silent was not the same as lying. The panel disagreed. Voss received a lifetime ban from all football-related activity and resigned from Kestrel United the same week. The club issued a public apology to Walter Doyle, restored his coaching badges through the Football Association, and offered him a position back at the academy he had helped build 20 years earlier. Wally did not accept straight away. He told the club, and he told me, that an apology 7 years late did not erase 7 years of missed birthdays, missed matches, and a pension he would now spend the rest of his life rebuilding. He was right, and I never once tried to talk him out of feeling that way. What he agreed to eventually, after 2 long conversations with our chairman and 1 very long conversation with me, was a trial period coaching the under-16s for a season, no promises beyond that, and no obligation to forgive anyone simply because the paperwork had finally been corrected. The first home match of the following season, I walked out for the warm-up and looked up at row 12, seat 8, out of habit more than anything else, the way I had looked at it before every match for 7 years. It was not empty. Wally was sitting there in a Kestrel United coat that still had the tags on it, arguing cheerfully with the elderly man beside him about a substitution decision from 3 seasons earlier neither of them could quite agree on. He caught me looking and gave me the same nod he used to give me on a gravel car park training ground when I was 8 years old, the nod that meant I had done something right without needing to be told. I scored twice that afternoon. I did not point at the seat. I did not need to anymore. Some gestures only mean something while the truth is still missing, and once it is finally out in the open, all that is left to do is play the game the way the man in row 12, seat 8, always told you to.